Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2022 Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecture. We would like to thank West Coast University for their continued support of AOTA and the OT community. West Coast University is our generous sponsor of this evening's Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecture. And if you haven't already, please visit them at booth 902 in the Expo Hall. And now, please welcome the president of the American Occupational Therapy Association, Dr. Wendy Hildenbrand.
Welcome, everyone. Long time no see. It's good to see you back again for this evening's lecture. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you as we celebrate the Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecture. At the 1930 AOTA conference in New Orleans, 92 years ago, for you that are trying to do the math, a presiding official, in recognizing the tireless work of Eleanor Clark Slagle, predicted that her name would stand out in history. Her place in history was cemented in 1954 with the establishment of the Eleanor Clark Slagle Lectureship, so named to honor her substantial contributions to the profession. As a founder, officer, and leader of the association, Mrs. Slagle commanded national and international renown as a speaker and consultant. As a person, she was described as possessing broad vision, charm, and dignity. Through the force of her personality and drive, she worked tirelessly to obtain recognition for occupational therapy and to establish high professional standards. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Roosevelt, and Adolph Meyer, the distinguished psychiatrist, were among the guests paying tribute to Mrs. Slagle at a dinner in her honor in 1937. So at that dinner, the association presented her with a gift that bore the inscription, "She has been the cornerstone in the development and promotion of occupational therapy." Wow, that's quite a stone. Through the years, all those selected to deliver the Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecture have emulated the ideals of Mrs. Slagle and have continued to build on her cornerstone. So before meeting tonight's lecturer, please join me in recognizing and honoring some of the former lecturers who are present tonight. For the 2020 lecture, Dr. Craig Veloso. Wow. For the 2016 lecture, Ms. Susan Garber. For the 2015 lecture, Dr. Helen Cohen. For the 2012 lecture, Dr. Karen Jacobs. It would not be an intro without a twirl. So, for the 2003 lecture, Dr. Charlotte Royeen. For the 2001 lecture, Dr. Winifred Dunn. And finally, for the 1986 lecture, Dr. Kathleen Reed. What an impressive group of scholars. Thank you all for your many contributions to the scholarship of occupational therapy. And thank you. So you can. So now, please welcome Dr. Winnie Dunn of the University of Missouri and Dr. Beth Pfeiffer of Temple University. They will be introducing Dr. Patton this evening, and here they are. And Winnie will be glad to know I did not move any notes. So she was concerned. Thank you. You guys are awesome.
Thanks.
It is our pleasure to introduce the Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecturer, Dr. Christy Patton. Dr. Patton is a tenured professor at NYU, where she served as chair of the OT department for 7 years, raising its ranking to number 8 in the United States. She is now Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Her impressive history of leadership and scholarship has resulted in 50 articles, 153 international presentations, and a TED NYU talk. Dr. Patton has been featured on national news for her innovative and progressive work. She has been the principal investigator of 25 grants totaling $17 million. She is also the co-author of 2 prominent practice guidelines on sensory processing and autism that have been added to the National U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality's Guidelines Clearinghouse. This information shows the foundation for why Dr. Patton is speaking with us today. Dr. Patton's scholarly focus is best summarized as authentic partnership with stakeholders, using a strength-based approach that celebrates the person's interests and passions to flourish in the community. Her work inherently advances inclusion and belonging for those we serve in all the same settings you and I find ourselves in as we conduct our daily lives. She has developed a strength-based frame of reference that challenges intervention paradigms grounded in deficit-based theories. Her work has altered the professional perspective, providing a model for both research and clinical approaches for our entire profession. Increasingly, her work aligns with disability and marginalized populations that refuse to be viewed through a deficit lens. It is based on assumptions of self-determination that satisfy the core psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. She demonstrates her commitment to these principles by including autistic people in the inception and implementation of research, seeing their contributions as critical to the validity of her findings. Additionally, her contribution promotes public understanding of occupational therapy and highlights the importance of stakeholder collaboration in all areas of OT.
Dr. Patton's work emphasizes service that is meaningful and translatable in authentic settings and activities. Her earlier work with children with autism and families made it clear that many traditional service approaches did not actually support these families in what they wanted and needed to do. Dr. Patton watched and listened to these she served and set out to change research approaches to focus on what is actually meaningful to others, rather than to perpetuate traditional practices. Dr. Patton is a fierce representative and advocate for OT. Even though virtually all of her work is interdisciplinary, there is no ambiguity that she is an occupational therapist in all of her projects. So it is clear what OT contributes to every enterprise. The self-advocates she partners with recognize her role as occupational therapist. They have been co-presenters with Dr. Patton nationally and internationally, providing another means for OT to be seen through a strength-based lens and in an advocacy context. Dr. Patton is inspirational in her commitment to helping others see scholarship and practice through a strength-based paradigm. This is more important than ever as we are in a time of national crisis that has substantially impacted core OT outcomes of health, quality of life, participation, occupational and social justice for so many people. The current crisis requires a fundamental shift in our perspective in which we view each other and our stakeholders for what we can do versus what we cannot do. Dr. Patton is a well-respected scholar and advocate whose work in strength-based paradigms is recognized everywhere. We are honored to introduce Dr. Christy Patton and know that her message is one that will resonate and change how each one of you view your practice and research programs. We truly believe that you will be qualitatively different 1 hour from now. She will inspire you to think bigger about your possibilities and change the lens that guides your work because of her message. She is a fierce woman who has a lot to say. Let's get this party started.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. A brief thank you to Dr. Winnie Dunn and Dr. Beth Pfeiffer for that warm introduction. I will save my thank yous till the end of this lecture, but know that I'm humbled by your words and blessed to call you colleagues and friends. If you will also indulge me for a minute, I would like to give specific recognition to Dr. Craig Veloso and Dr. Sharon Gutman, the Eleanor Clark Slagle lecturers before we could come together in person. The wisdom they shared during a surreal time period transcended the Zoom screens we listened to them on. I want us to take a moment to recognize Dr. Craig Veloso from the Medical University of South Carolina and Dr. Sharon Gutman from Columbia University. Sharon is not here today, but thank you, Craig, for standing and getting the applause that is not the really weird Zoom silent clap that we all so well-deserved, and thank you for your incredible work. A note before I start. I will be adding visual descriptions of any information on my slides that I do not talk about or reference in my lecture for access purposes for individuals with visual impairments or those that are just multitasking and just listening. First, I'm a middle-aged white woman dressed in a red suit standing behind a podium up on a stage in front of a large crowd, proud to wear red as an ally to autistic advocates. Today, April 1st, is World Autism Day, traditionally represented by the color blue. However, red is the color of autism acceptance preferred by the autistic community, shifting the narrative. My first title slide is Finding Our Strengths, and you'll see a picture of Washington Square Park, New York City, my home and home of New York University. I would like to begin my talk by grounding us in the words of a famous philosopher who once described a process to examine our own lives. But first, I will give you an advanced organizer of my Slagle Lecture. I'm going to ask you to question the models you use to practice, teach, and research. Our practices are often grounded in deficit-based approaches where we are the experts who provide services to remediate weaknesses. No one builds their lives on remediated weaknesses. No one. Who does a deficit-based approach benefit? Do our current models of practice support flourishing? Our professional biases make it hard for us to see how our practices are getting it wrong. I will propose a paradigm shift to a strength-based model that interrogates our educational, research, and practice systems. So that is where we're going. So back to that famous philosopher. In the words of Ted Lasso, seen here, Jason Sudeikis in character on the corner of the slide, I'm going to ask you to be curious, not judgmental. Be curious, not judgmental. Be curious. Curious about your own practices. Curious about your research. Curious about how you're educating the next generation of occupational therapy practitioners. And for students out there, be curious as to what type of practitioner, educator, or scholar you want to be. Zora Neale Hurston, a noted scholar and author, pictured here as a young black woman in a hat smiling at the camera, defined research as formalized curiosity, poking and prodding with a purpose. So I'd like you to invite you to poke and prod and be curious and challenge the assumptions our assumptions as occupational therapy practitioners. It's a little slow. What biases do we bring to our work? How can we truly embrace a strength-based lens? I will argue that to do this, we have to be curious. We also have to be wrong. As Sidney Harris, a journalist and essayist, pictured here as a white man in a suit smiling at the camera, identifies, one of the hardest tasks is to admit we are wrong. Being wrong requires us to reflect and rethink our views. Being wrong requires an inquiry mindset. As shown here in a series of diverse people doing the face slap emoji, it is hard to admit we are wrong. Think about the last time you admitted you were wrong. We need to lower the stakes of being wrong. With a curiosity or inquiry mindset, we might ask, what are the limitations of what I currently know? Who do I know it from? What voices inform our practice, education, and research? What have I gotten wrong, and how do I know? With my bachelor's degree in hand from Elizabethtown College in 1987, I began to practice addressing deficits that autistic individuals display. As a researcher, I studied those deficits and examined the efficacy of interventions designed to reduce those deficits. I worked hard to help autistic individuals be more like their peers, more neurotypical, if you will. I believed that if we could fix or change behavior, we could help autistic individuals overcome barriers that prevented inclusion. Then, while at Temple University, my colleague, Dr. Moya Keneally, who's right in the front row, and I interviewed individuals who typed independently to communicate, but were non-speaking. Each of those individuals demonstrated atypical behaviors associated with autism: flapping, repetitive movements, lack of eye contact, and sensory hypersensitivities. I knew these weaknesses. I knew these deficits. These were familiar. I knew this narrative. And I could not have been more wrong. Our first interviewee typed that he wanted to write a book on how Foucault looked at normalcy and disability and how power and knowledge marginalize those who differ from the norm. This was his aspiration, while each and every semester he had to prove that he was more capable than his below 70 IQ test, which had labeled him as less than capable for a college degree, while at the same time be impaired enough to need a full-time aide. His professors questioned his competence based on his presentation. Today, we still would focus on his outward behavior versus his inherent strengths and aspirations. We would want to reduce his self-stimulatory behaviors, and we would do as Foucault identified, marginalize him as being different from the norm. I realized that by focusing on deficits, autistic individuals could not identify their own strengths after a life of others underestimating their abilities and failing to see their competence. We thought we had done our job and done it well, but we had not given autistic individuals a path to success. Service providers, myself included, had framed a language of deficit and weaknesses that was reinforced by society. This doesn't mean there are not challenges. The challenges are real. Sensory issues like auditory hypersensitivity were familiar to me. But by taking a deficit lens, my focus would be to treat the auditory hypersensitivity. What does this miss? As Paul Kotler, a non-speaking friend and activist, described it here, it misses the rest of the story. He wrote what you can see. Auditory hypersensitivity? Yes, absolutely. Breathtaking auditory magic because, not in spite of this sensitivity, yes. Others we interviewed said autism is who they are, not what they have. The autistic way of being was central to how they experienced the world. Yet most professionals held the cards as to how they should behave, communicate, and maintain eye contact as a sign of success. A chorus of autistic adults told us flat out, I can look at you or I can listen. Pick one. By forcing our neurotypical rules about what makes a successful student, worker, or friend, we missed who they were, their story. Service systems were complicit with a deficit-based approach, leading to poor outcomes, including anxiety and depression, often associated with autism. Professionals have set a look more like everyone else standard for neurodivergent individuals. Sit still, don't flap, look at me. Imagine asking a wheelchair user to stand up, walk like me. We can't imagine that. But we have been judging neurodivergent performance by unattainable and unnecessary standards. Imagine a world where the object or activity that helped you make sense of that world was only given to you if you did exactly what you were told to do, and maybe only if you did it for 3 out of 3 trials. Imagine a world where everyone around you focused on improving your weaknesses every single day. That is the community we created for many of our autistic students. By listening, I realized I was wrong. I learned a different perspective, a strength-based perspective. A strength-based model seeks to affirm, challenge, and evolve our beliefs. We can learn if we lower the stakes of being wrong. So be curious and be wrong. We have been well-intentioned but wrong. We study lack of empathy in autistic individuals without examining our own lack of empathy toward the autistic way of being. We focus on deficits while giving lip service to a person's strengths. How was I perpetuating this? I had to be curious. Why was I studying all that was wrong without considering what was right? How is society complicit in perpetuating a deficit narrative? And what is my role in overturning that paradigm? How can we acknowledge the challenges while seeing a person's capacity and brilliance? This is the power of being wrong. I now frame all my work and my identity as a human being in strength-based, authentic partnerships. What I consider relevant is now rooted in the wisdom of lived experience of autistic scholars and activists. That is the power of embracing being wrong. That is my story. But what does that mean for the profession? AOTA's Vision 2025 states we are an inclusive profession that maximizes health, well-being, and quality of life for all peoples, population, and communities through effective solutions that facilitate participation in everyday living. Should be familiar. You've probably heard that a couple times already. Let's break that down. Are we an inclusive profession? Do we view disability, gender, race, sexual identity, and class as multiplying factors that discriminate historically marginalized groups? Do we acknowledge that these intersections create overlapping barriers to access and independence? Does our focus on deficits maximize health, well-being, and quality of life? Does our intense focus on individual independence turn our attention away from solutions that facilitate fuller participation? Whose voices do we include as we think about effective solutions? What have we gotten wrong? Grant Blasco, an 18-year-old non-speaking autistic young man from the Northwest, pictured here as a young white man in a sweater sitting and smiling at the camera, who is a consultant with our inclusion programs, states, to use whether or not someone is independent as the measure of success when professionals have no idea what it is like day in and day out to deal with systemic bias seems cruel and insensitive. Whoa, we might be taken aback by being called cruel and insensitive for having independence as a goal. Remember, be curious, not judgmental. If we are curious, we wonder why we use independence as a measure of success and what could be wrong about that metric. Personal independence ignores systemic barriers that interfere with independence as well as the desire for self-defined interdependence. For example, if Grant is not independent by our standards, how quickly do we attribute it to his lack of motivation, or even worse, a failure to comply, rather than considering how lack of resources, opportunities, and environmental barriers contribute to his performance? Grant demands that we consider more than client factors. If we are curious, we would ask, what is missing? Lauren Melissa Elzy, an autistic adult woman from the Northeast, pictured here as a young black woman in a striped sweater who looks directly at the camera and is an employee full-time of our NYU ASD Nest Support Project, speaks directly to you, the therapy community, and asks you to pause. Listen to what we need from you. Listen to what has hurt us. I have encountered practitioners who are overjoyed to see autistics behaving more like their neurotypical peers. Is our goal to teach autistics to mask? Because autistics will always be autistic. Each time I am praised for not being autistic, I learn that people like me when I'm not me. They like me when I'm not me. Lauren and Melissa ask us to pause and reflect. By writing goals for normal behavior, are we maximizing health and well-being? Or are we telling individuals that to be successful, you have to be more like others, to mask your true self? Kenji Yoshino, a colleague at NYU Law, pictured as a middle-aged Asian man with half his face on the front of the book entitled Covering, writes, outsiders are included, but only if we behave as insiders. That is, only if we cover. Groups should make a common cause against coerced covering, demanding an equality not staked on conformity. Are we demanding conformity? When we remove demands for individuals to mask or cover their authentic selves, what choice and autonomy and life does that open up? Can we challenge intervention and research that supports this type of coerced covering? Lawrence Carter Long, a dear colleague and advocate born with cerebral palsy, pictured here as a middle-aged white man smiling and holding a sign that says "Visibility Matters," outlines an impossible demand. In order for people with disabilities to be respected or even considered worthy or valuable, they must overcome their conditions. They must strive to be normal, meaning not disabled, which is impossible. This is a recipe for guaranteed failure. Success is determined not by the person's achievements, skills, and talents, but rather by the disabled person's desire to become like non-disabled people. A deficit-based approach is of little to no practical value at best, and at worst, sets everyone up for disappointment, if not failure across the board, disabled or not. We can, we must do better. Lawrence highlights a philosophy that is grounded in the field of disability studies. We have strong roots arguing for occupational therapy to embrace a disability studies perspective over the years, but have been slow to integrate these concepts into our practice, education, and research. We have made strides in thinking beyond the medical model to embrace the social model of disability, but how have we shifted our daily practice? We do so many things right, so why do we have to look critically? Why do we need to be curious? Why do we need to consider what we may have gotten wrong? Because historically, healthcare professionals have had an oversized role in determining disability identity. Disability activists argue, and I agree, that this gatekeeper role perpetuates experts who fix the problem and may continue to ask research questions that are irrelevant to the people we serve. A focus on person factors misses opportunities to research, develop supports, and teach about systemic and environmental barriers as the true challenge. We center disability as residing in the individual, which leads to singular therapeutic solutions rather than creating collective public solutions. For some illnesses, wounds, injuries, and disease processes, the medical model is very appropriate. And this is not an April Fool's joke. When I had to have emergency surgery to remove my gallbladder a little over 2 weeks ago, I was very glad the surgeon was operating from the medical model versus asking me about a disability rights perspective. We are an integral part of the medical system, but we cannot apply the same mindset to fix disability. For disabled individuals, the medical model has not provided all the answers or asked all the right questions. Disability study scholars have offered alternative models that now dominate much of the discourse. But how does that translate into occupational therapy practice? I would like us to go back in order to move forward. In his book, The Politics of Disablement, Michael Oliver, a disabled activist, first used the term social model to describe a shift towards the examination of disability that looks at how society's attitudes and environments disable the individual. The field of occupational therapy, being at the forefront at that time, quickly took up the call to make this shift. Our timeline starts in 1991. Dr. Mary Law's Muriel Driver Memorial Lecture for the Canadian Occupational Therapy Association in 1991 called for OT to eliminate disabling environments, dismantle classification of individuals based on norms, change the perception of disability as deviance, and examine the unequal power dynamic between clients and clinicians that contribute to these issues. Dr. Law also urged OT practitioners to achieve equity, through critique and change, advocating both formal and informal curiosity with a realization that some of our practices were not conducive to equitable interventions. The timeline continues to 1994 in the Slagle Lecture entitled Building Inclusive Community, a Challenge for Occupational Therapy. Dr. Ann Grady highlighted that in the past, disability was usually viewed as a medical problem with the expectation that to be accepted, persons with disabilities needed to be as much like persons without disabilities as possible without regard for their own uniqueness. Dr. Grady felt that change lied in shifting to an interactional model where disability is derived from an interaction between the individual and the environment. And we needed to have opportunities and resources in communities to support inclusion. The timeline continues to 2005, when in a special issue on disability studies and occupational therapy, AJOT guest editor Dr. Gary Kielhofner, along with many authors that may be in this room or listening live, called on our profession to examine the critiques of rehabilitation from a disability studies perspective and consider the implications for occupational therapy. He suggested emphasizing public education and societal attitude change with the need to foster self-advocacy. He wanted us to play a role and stop practices that encourage negative attitudes and self-doubt in the populations we serve. And finally, he wondered if we were strong enough to let our consumers decide whether we are valuable. Since that special issue, shown here alongside a special issue from 2021, OT scholars have made significant contributions to disability studies. This culminated in a recent issue of AJOT in summer of 2021, whose guest editors from the Occupational Therapy and Disability Studies Network renewed the call for change and hoped that occupational therapy would finally make the changes necessary to better align with the disability community and prioritize working for social change. Sheth and colleagues interviewed 11 of the 13 original authors of the 2005 AJOT issue to revisit their thoughts as to how occupational therapy has aligned itself with disability studies in the last 15 years. We have come far in some areas. The authors specifically mentioned that we recognize client-directed, meaningful occupations as central to OT's purpose. We consider environment and community accessibility. And we now focus on population health and primary care. But what is missing? As the timeline continues to 2021, these original authors felt that we still need to embrace methodologies that center voices, collaborate with and center marginalized populations in our profession, connect disability studies content with practice realities. And again, and I can't stress this enough, partner authentically with the disability community in practice, education, and research. And I would add that it is also essential to, in 2022, center the voices of historically marginalized communities at the intersection of disability, race, gender, sexuality, and class, who face ableism and discrimination from systems that create barriers to full participation. What do we need to do so that we are not writing the same thing in 15 years? Here we go. Here's the call. I believe we have not adopted an anti-ableism lens. Ableism refers to a societal preference for non-disabled ways of being that contributes to bias and discrimination against disabled people. It is the belief that typical abilities are superior. Like racism and sexism, ableism defines entire groups as less than. Ableism is entangled in our assessments. We create assessments which measure deficits and confirm that individuals are disabled because they are different from the norm. We give awards to non-disabled actors playing an inspirational character with a disability. Although 25% of the population of individuals have a disability, only 3% of media characters have a disability. Even worse, of that 3%, 95% of them are portrayed by characters that are by non-disabled actors. 95%. Scripts themselves reduce the narrative to an inspirational story of overcoming tragedy and hardship or being saved by a non-disabled character. These views are in direct opposition to the disability rights and disability justice movement. Ableism in healthcare results in a person with a disability receiving lower quality care. The disparities grow exponentially when disability, race, and gender intersect. A study from 2020 found that nearly 84% of healthcare workers, 84% of healthcare professionals implicitly preferred people without disabilities. Educators have not embedded training on ableism and disability justice. We have not centered the voices of historically marginalized groups in our narrative. Researchers have not partnered with advocates to ask their questions, address their priorities. Self-advocates and stakeholders need to be the designers of our research. We need to ask questions that are meaningful to the disability community. We need to be the profession that shifts the narrative from overcoming disability to overcoming ableism. To accomplish these changes, we must commit to listening to the disabled experts and center those voices in practice, research, and teaching. A quick example. For years, neurodiverse individuals have told us that eye contact is distracting and even overwhelming. Why do we insist on eye contact? We have all been part of a natural experiment the last couple of years that actually illustrates how important it is to have the right voices, asking the right questions, and being listened to when they share their truth, their experiences. What is the experiment you all unknowingly participated in? Zoom. And shout out to Dr. Aqua. This is his anatomy class, NYU anatomy class. And anyone that ever had NYU anatomy class? Okay, show of hands. Who's experienced Zoom fatigue? All right, I think we have consensus. Professor Jeremy Ballinson, director of Stanford University's Virtual Human Interaction Lab, has postulated that nonverbal overload is a potential cause for Zoom fatigue, specifically exceeding eye gaze. A deficit approach that prioritizes normalization and compliance leads to writing goals to increase eye contact, in spite of autistic advocates claiming it's an inappropriate goal and produces stress. Well, we now have had the lived experience of excessive eye contact demands and its impact on our levels of fatigue. If appropriate eye contact is the goal, then Zoom gave us many opportunities to practice. But what happened? We all wanted to turn our cameras off. We're happy when our calendar showed a phone call, or better yet, a webinar where we don't have to be on camera or speak. As Dr. or at least I did, I really like this. As Dr. Ballinson points out, from a perceptual standpoint, Zoom effectively smothers everyone with eye gaze. Zoom asks for 8 times more eye gaze. That's why you're fatigued. That's why you want your cameras off. And how do we respond? We say no. We turn off our camera. We respect differences, and no one demands more. When we long for less eye contact, we have options. If eye gaze is your goal for me in therapy and is the only way I get rewarded with movement, a break, or a favorite object, I have no options. So how do we shift our thinking? We need to widen our lens, and as Maya Angelou said, once we know better, we have to do better. So where do we start to be better? Dolly Chugh, my colleague at NYU and author, says it depends on where you enter this conversation. She calls it her 10% rule. Let's apply the rule to confront ableism in occupational therapy. This is a slide that shows 10% more mortifying, terrified, and satisfying with Dolly Chugh's cover in the corner. If this is the first time you have heard the word ableism, have never had a conversation with a disabled individual regarding their views of the medicalization of their disability, or never considered your own professional bias, be 10% more mortified. Why 10%? That means it's challenging, but an attainable goal. Why mortified? If this is your first time looking at your own practice, it is a little mortifying to realize your unwitting actions, your past practices, your interactions with colleagues, and the ableist world around you. Dolly recommends staying with it. Don't shut down. Build your knowledge. Be willing to be wrong. If you have done some work, you have posted on social media, and are learning about disability, justice, and ableism, be 10% more terrified. You have been on the bench. Get in the game and take a risk. Bet on your new insight and your new values, and ask the hard question. Challenge someone. Dolly recommends seizing those moments where you would have stepped back to step in. Act on your knowledge and stay curious. If you are committed to disability justice because of an identity you hold or because it's fundamentally a part of who you are, be 10% more satisfied. Satisfied that hopefully the rest of us are stepping up and you don't have to respond to every request and every demand on your time. You can catch your breath knowing others are stepping in finally. Take a break. Be better. Be willing to be wrong, be curious, be better. And you get to decide how and what matters. I'm hoping this talk will sensitize you to a different perspective. As Adam Grant points out, the person most likely to persuade you is not me, but you. You get to decide how you're going to change your mind after this talk and what resonates with you. So it's up to you. I'm done with my job now. Once you begin to see ableism and lack of disability representation, you will see it everywhere. Roy Grinker, an anthropologist who wrote Unstrange Minds, used this famous FedEx image of negative space to point out that there was not an unexplained epidemic of autism. In fact, autistic individuals were always there, but we never saw autistic representation and had a narrow definition. He asked people to see what was in this famous FedEx logo that they may not notice. What do you see besides FedEx? The arrow. Some of you who didn't see the arrow? But once you know, you always see it. It's clearly there and all the time. It has always been there. What? It was always there. It was always there. So for those of you who are seeing the arrow for the first time in my front row here, my apologies as you over-focus on FedEx trucks in the next couple of weeks. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. But a very small, specific part of your world and the way you see it has been changed. Very small and specific part of your world. Maybe just by a millimeter in terms of all you see. But a millimeter can be critical, as James Baldwin identified. He wrote, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter, even by a millimeter, the way a person looks or people look at reality, then you can change it," with the picture of James Baldwin in the corner as a middle-aged black man in a suit staring at the camera. My work is with autistic adults, children, and youth. I give a disclaimer in my lectures and writing when I use the term autistic adult or autistic student, which some of you might be wondering about, which violates the person-first language that we are all taught. The majority of autistic individuals prefer this identity-first language. Why do I say non-speaking versus nonverbal? Quite simply, the work I have done with disability advocates informs all I do, starting with language. It is the FedEx arrow I cannot unsee. Non-speaking simply implies the individual does not speak verbally and may use alternative means to communicate. If I say nonverbal, we already have an opinion on ability to speak, but we also may quickly make assumptions regarding cognitive ability. I no longer say high or low functioning, but rather discuss functioning by considering how much support someone needs and how many barriers they face daily. How about we stop labeling high and low functioning individuals and start labeling high and low functioning environments? Our tools of the profession, including our therapeutic use of self, assessments, goals, and interventions, serve the needs of the individual. If we commit to a disability studies, rights, and justice perspective in practice, then we would also use our skills and turn those tools with vengeance onto the environment, systemic bias, and ableism every chance we get. A high-functioning environment that has resources, opportunities, and strength-based attitudes might consist of a school with an OT and speech-language pathologist who work very closely together and have time to work together, and are experienced with a variety of AAC options that are integrated seamlessly with a student's day with a fully trained staff who honor inherent strengths and aspirations. Schools without the same financial and personnel resources as well as attitude resources could be a low-functioning environment. Every environment where ableism and discrimination are present is low-functioning. We must advocate for high-functioning environments and stop giving the systems that enable an environment to be low-functioning a pass. Wheelchair users gain independence, mobility, and freedom, so the term wheelchair-bound is inappropriate. It is the low-functioning environments that bind them: inaccessible public transportation, homes, and workplaces. We as a profession make a commitment to doing better when we choose descriptors that honor lived experiences. And what does it mean to say special needs? Housing, Employment, transportation, friends, and meaningful hobbies are important to everyone. Special quickly becomes wrong or defective as we attempt to normalize others in what are often segregated, low-functioning environments, ultimately excluding those that we have placed at the margins. We also stigmatize and bully special at significantly higher rates as a society. Professionals foster this ableist language. We simulate disability experiences in educational programs by spending a day in a wheelchair, which merely shows how difficult it is for me, a non-wheelchair user, to navigate. We learn that what barriers exist in a day. What if we show how difficult it is for an expert wheelchair user to navigate an appointment or work due to unreliable transportation options? What if we listen as wheelchair users explain what they deal with and the bias they face? We understand physical inaccessibility, but do we see the systemic bias that makes an environment difficult to navigate due to discrimination, low expectations, and policies that deny inclusion and full participation? Friedman and Van Pumbroek examined OT students' explicit and implicit disability attitudes. From entry to graduation, conscious, explicit attitudes about disability became more positive overall, while negative implicit bias grew or stayed the same. Does OT education actually reinforce ableist attitudes? What happens when new practitioners enter the profession with the preconceived notion that disability is negative or something to be fixed with their expertise? And I know you may be sitting there saying, of course I'm not biased towards disability as an OT practitioner. But I ask you again to be curious, not judgmental. Let's do a quick exercise. This is an evaluation report with presenting problems, many lines, and one line for strengths at the bottom. This should ring true if you think about every evaluation report you have read or written. We focus on what we assess, and this is how we assess. We strengthen the bias towards disability as deficit with each evaluation we do, or goals we write where the balance is tilted so dramatically towards impairment. Our impairment-based models rely on assessments that place the problem solely within the person. The social model situates the problem within the environment. Holler and colleagues found greater support among occupational therapy practitioners for the social model when they thought about involving clients. However, interventions still lean towards the medical model. Once we choose the medical model, societal attitudes, stigma, bias, and ableism get a pass. The individual is now defined by weaknesses and impairments to overcome, and the therapist has to change the individual's behaviors. So where does a strength-based model land? It is an understanding of the challenges, but with a recognition that we build our lives on our strengths. We first have to recognize our bias towards the medicalization of disability and have, as Steele described, a constant back and forth between ideas and research that hammers away at bias and, just as important, often reveals aspects of reality that surpass our original ideas and insights. What this back and forth with disability advocates has revealed is that we need new models that are more than individual impairments and environmental barriers. Liz Jackson at Critical Access asked us to consider what the disability story is and who is telling it. In what I hope is the back of a pizza box, I think it is, she outlines the medical, social, and cultural models. And she frames it from the perspective of who is telling the story. We get a more nuanced model rooted in authentic relationships with disabled people telling the story. The cultural model presented here is grounded in that story, not how the medical community frames their story. Shakespeare and colleagues state that the bifurcation of these models that reduce disability to either impairment or barriers or oppression misses the relational piece that situates disability as the outcome of the interactions between the person with the impairment and the wider context. My research team, in partnership with autistic advocates, have questioned the deficit-focused approach in school-based practice as we try to do better. For example, the world of research looks at restricted interests that autistic individuals have from a deficit lens. It is the researcher's story, not the autistic individual's story. The research community clearly sees evidence of restricted interest as problematic. and grew that evidence base in their designs and questions. But what happens when we conceptualize restricted interest with a more relational or cultural frame between the person and the environment? To do that, we have to talk to the person and see their view of these interests. It becomes their story, not the professional or researcher's story. This is a slide that shows a survey that we did with autistic adults reflecting back on their school-based experience. It's a combination of two questions on one slide with strongly agree on the far left and strongly disagree on the far right. And what you can see is autistic individuals really want teachers, therapists using their preferred interest. But sadly, that rarely happens. And when it is their story, this picture changes. Interests are viewed as central to learning and could be incorporated into all aspects of learning, endorsed by, as you can see, nearly 88% of the autistic respondents, but that only happened around 13% of the time. That is their story. That is what they're waiting for. In this slide, you can also see that these interests are calming, positive, not anxiety-producing or negative, as compared to the researchers' view of these interests. This was their story, and there was strong agreement. We know that we've gotten it wrong in utilizing interest. We as a profession have taken an evidence-based stance. In AOTA's most recent Choosing Wisely campaign, as we stated, don't provide interventions for autistic persons to reduce or eliminate restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors, activities or interest without evaluating and understanding the meaning of the behavior to the person as well as personal and environmental factors, which is an excellent recognition and shift from viewing restricted interest as problematics. My autistic colleagues would ask us to go even further and wiser, which is the next slide. Okay, we'll do it here. They would cross out everything from without and just say, don't. Don't provide those interventions. So this is a start, but how can we be better? What would be 10% more terrifying? It could be questioning the interventions that try to reduce or eliminate interest, researching use of interest and the outcomes, changing the way we write about these interests, educating parents as to how these interests should be reframed, with occupational therapy practitioners taking the lead. This is knowing that we were wrong and doing better. In Dr. Ann Grady's Slagle Lecture, she hints at what I call the fallacy of readiness. She discusses how children and adults with disabilities have to demonstrate a sense of self-esteem before they can be included in a typical classroom or work or living environment. A low-functioning environment is one where disabled individuals have to prove themselves capable. We build vocational and social skills often as preparation and readiness for work and social connection. Others learn work and social skills through participation. What is the price of admission for inclusion? What systems demand normalization, compliance, covering, and masking versus authenticity? Instead of professionals determining readiness, what if we created opportunities in high-functioning environments that were related to interests, access, and abilities that didn't demand readiness first, but rather presumed success? In our NSF project entitled Ideas, Inventing, Designing, and Engineering with Autistic Students, we used interest-based maker clubs to let students build and create with their interests and passions and be socially, authentically themselves. It is a high-functioning environment. In her doctoral dissertation research, my former PhD student, Dr. Yulun Chen, who is here today, observed social behaviors and interactions between autistic and non-autistic middle school students. She applied Damian Milton's double empathy problem, which suggests that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they struggle to empathize with each other. And it's represented here by a traffic sign with arrows going in very different directions. Milton posits that there is a breakdown in reciprocity and mutual understanding that can happen between people with varying different ways of experiencing the world. Dr. Chen found better interaction among outcomes among youth within than across neurotypes. In other words, autistic to autistic social interaction does not have any autistic social deficits. She suggests that autistic social difficulties may result from differences in the social expectations and profiles between autistic and non-autistic youth. So then what about interventions? your interventions would change. Interventions would then seek to support peer engagement in autistic youth that will focus on facilitating this mutual understanding across neurotypes and also promoting a culture of openness to non-normative social styles. Instead of linking social interactions with autism, negative social factors such as the lack of mutual understanding explain how the double empathy may empirically play a much larger part in the well-being and disparities in social interaction experienced by autistic individuals. These added social stressors can be simply due to membership in a marginalized and socially oppressed group. Meyer coined the term minority stress models to describe the added stress that is experienced by these groups above and beyond the day-to-day stressors that are typically experienced. They are additive, chronic, and driven by social forces. So think about your well-being as this nice, strong Jenga tower. Everyone's familiar with a Jenga tower? Social disadvantage and marginalization create an increased burden that can result in mental and physical health disparities. If you are a member of a marginalized group, you then start experiencing the proximal stressors. The proximal stressors are the individual blocks we start pulling out of the strong Jenga tower with that strong foundation. These proximal stressors include internalized stigma, internalized ableism, often caused by living in a world not built for you or designed with you in mind, which is underscored by lack of representation. This can cause feelings of worthlessness, anxiety, and exhaustion, and perceived burden. This is magnified in multiply marginalized groups. The distal stressors we then add to the top as they pile up on top of the unsteady Jenga tower. And they significantly decrease psychological well-being, and these stressors include harassment, discrimination, bullying, and violence. Again, this is magnified in multiply marginalized groups. For example, disabled LGBTQ+ youth have a higher suicide rate and a higher rate of peer victimization than either straight disabled youth or non-disabled LGBTQ+ youth. The proximal and distal stressors magnify. These minority stress models have more recently been applied to disability communities. Minority stressors affect the severity of depression in those with physical disabilities. Monique Bota, an autistic academic and activist, and David Frost showed that minority stress models predicted significantly worse well-being, higher psychological distress, and poorer mental health in the autistic community. Community connection and peer support from affinity groups combat the impact of minority stress. My colleagues that are autistic researchers are reading what non-autistic researchers are writing. And as Monique Bota has stated, to be involved in autism research when you are autistic is to constantly experience the aggression of a field which has yet to come to terms with its own ableism. They are pictured in the corner in a plaid shirt with bright red lipstick looking at the camera. They were speaking of psychology, and we have to be curious about what autistic researchers would say about OT research. Those with the most power in the systems of care ought to be doing 10% more terrifying work, so my self-advocate colleagues will know that OTs will be challenging their own professional systems that are ableist, and by listening to disabled individuals in research when they say, this is not okay, or this is not important to me. A strength-based model for occupational therapy has us leaning into our strengths. We are a profession that is already making these shifts in partnership with stakeholders. I would argue we are a step ahead of other healthcare professionals. Now it's time to take a leap. In practice, education, and research, it's now time to act. So I offer this call to action. You decide where you are in the conversation. But as a field, we need to confront our own ableism and commit to be better. So take a look at these phrases, such as documenting strengths, changing your language. I'll give you a minute to take a look at them. Pick one based on what you have heard and what resonated with you. And on the count of 3, I'm going to ask you to say, I commit to, whichever you choose, and to say it out loud. This is the audience participation of the speech. Ready? You got yours? You got your phrase? 1, 2, 3. I commit to. Oh, wait. Okay. Well, I gave away my tagline. But you know what you're committing to. You know what you're committing to. I committed to apologizing. Remember those autistic adults who taught me how wrong I was? I committed to apologizing for not knowing what I know now. We'll tell you a quick story. After those interviews, I called up Bill's mother. Bill was a 28-year-old non-speaking autistic man who came to me for sensory-based therapy before I interviewed all of the non-speaking adults. He enjoyed it and made great progress, but I always knew there was so much more in there than I could get out. I'm sure you all have those individuals that you're working with. Once I had done these interviews that fundamentally changed the way I practiced, I called Bill's mom and asked her to put him on the phone. I told him how sorry I was that I didn't know how important it was to presume competence and work tirelessly for a communication system. I continued my one-way conversation for another couple of minutes before his mother took the phone back and asked me what I had said to Bill. I told her I had apologized for being wrong and what I had learned. His reaction the whole time I was talking was a big smile, coupled with tears running down his face. I had to do better. We can and will be leaders in this shift, but a warning, this will be hard work. We truly have to listen, be curious, be wrong, and be better. The work will be counterintuitive to what you have learned to get to this moment. Learning counterintuitive ideas is, according to Deborah Kellerman, akin to becoming a fluent speaker of a second language. And as Motrin identifies, we not only have to learn a different language, but avoid that language that frames disability as a defect. As researchers, we have to learn a new language. Kat Hughes highlights this with a counterintuitive research finding. The finding, autistic teens are more positive and involved during conflict with parents than non-autistic teens. The authors are desperately trying to explain their findings from their bias, their deficit framing. Can we see the FedEx arrow here? Can we see this differently? Can we look at the findings through a strength-based lens? Researchers, we can do better. Practitioners, Paul Kotler asks us to be better in our expectations and creativity. Paul writes, I think expectations should change. People like me are asked to act like neurotypical people to be included in things. We have not been creative enough as a society to come up with ways to integrate people with autism without setting impossible expectations. Without access and visibility, we cannot show people our capability. And educators, Liz Jackson says we have learned to teach the how of disability with accessibility, technology, assessment, and interventions. Let's be better and embrace a disability studies and disability justice perspective in order to teach the who, what, and why. So in closing, I would like us to apply some of what we learned in our time together. This shift from a deficit to a strength-based lens doesn't work with piecemeal instruction and infrequent practice, or I would argue one Eleanor Clark Slagle lecture. So let's practice one more time before I leave you today. Back to Grant. When asking for his permission to use his quote that was from a conference he did with us, I asked him if he had any specific thoughts based on his experience with OT and ableism. He was on break with his family, but responded and said that he would think about it. But off the cuff, he thinks, OT should stop giving out sensory toys for dysregulation due to systemic oppression. That was his off-the-cuff comment, so I don't know what he's thinking about now that he's done it. So, if we are curious, we may be shocked initially. That's okay. But then ask ourselves, what is a day like for non-speaking autistic students in a self-contained classroom where staff, perhaps including OT practitioners, may not presume competence? What is it like to fully understand what is being said to you without a means of expression? What is it like to have a full day with a wide range of emotions and experience potentially reduced to, he did not listen when it was time to come inside from recess? Such a sensory toy may be helpful, but does it impact a very low functioning environment? That is why this will be hard, because we will get defensive and say, wait, this is a good thing. It may be, but if you are curious, you will also see it's not enough. You will see what Grant is talking about without the defensiveness. You will listen and you will do differently. So let's imagine our future plans together in partnership with disability communities and activists. Let's build occupational therapy on our strengths, not our remediated weaknesses. Let's be curious, be wrong, and be better. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So done.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Wow, everybody's on their feet for that. It's exciting. Thank you so much. They're going to have to roll that script again.
Oh, no.
Oh,
Okay. They don't have your script. You're just going to have to wing it.
I am. I'm going to just have to say thank you so much. Right? There's a thing. I don't know about you, but Dr. Patton speaks to all of us in ways that we need to take home, and I'm just so thrilled. Take home, take to our practice, take to your research, take to your science, take to the people we serve, make it matter. So just wonderful message for all of us. She gets to hang this on her wall and do something wonderful with things on the back. So just thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, come on up. Come on up. Come here. Oh, we need our picture. Okay, I'll do my best. Thank you so much. I'd like to take a brief moment that could be so expansive to thank several people and groups. I want to thank Drs. Winnie Dunn and Beth Pfeiffer and Dr. Moya Keneally, who nominated me for this award. The gift of time given to think about these ideas and put them on paper was priceless, and I thank you. For the faculty, students, and alumni that have been part of my NYU OT family, I see you out there, for the last 15 years, I have felt your support at every step of the way, and it has made all the difference. A special thank you to my PhD students, past and present, all sitting together. Your ideas and work have pushed this work and our strength-based lens powerfully forward. To faculty, alumni, and students from Elizabethtown College and Temple University, thank you for giving me the perfect places and opportunities to learn who my authentic self as an OT is and will continue to be. To leadership at AOTA and AOTF, thank you for supporting stakeholder inclusion. Let's continue to be 10% or maybe 20% more terrifying in advancing those efforts. To all my OT colleagues and friends, too numerous to name but held in such regard, that are out there, who have been such an integral part of my growth, I thank you. To my family, as my sister Janine articulated, we are a family that shows up. To my sons, Thomas and James, you have always been there, believing in a working mom with a passion and never letting me think I got the work-mom balance wrong, even when you know I did. Your support is more important and your love is more important than you'll ever know. I'm one of 6 siblings. Stacy, Janine, Kevin, and Jason are all here tonight, along with my sister-in-law Meredith, nephew Jake, and niece Emily Patton, who I can proudly say is the other OT in our family. My aunt and uncle, who live in Texas and thought this would be a fun night out, also came. We gave my baby brother Josh, a writer for Saturday Night Live, a pass, as he did have a good excuse, I suppose, but he always got a pass as the youngest of 6. To my mom, Joyce Patton, who is here, I learned firsthand and early what happens when you look for the good in everyone and the strengths in all. Mom, you were and are a profound teacher. And although my dad passed away over 11 years ago, a colleague once said to me, "If he was my dad, I think I could have been an astronaut." Thanks for helping us all reach for the stars, Dad. You are missed. And last, because I want you to remember the last thing I said, and with profound thanks, I want to thank every self-advocate I have worked with over the years: Stephen, Paul, Lauren, Grant, Becca, William, Lawrence, Lydia, Dina, Damien, Jesse, Max, Bill, Robin, Amy, Marenike, Julia, Shira, and so many more. It is you who are my best teachers, my colleagues, and for several of you, my dear friends. You have taught me to be curious, be wrong, and be better. Oh, now they have Wendy's thank you, so she already said those. Okay, hold on. This evening, I have the honor of passing the Slagle baton to the recipient of the 2023 Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecture, Dr. Mary C. Lawler. Oh. Dr. Lawler is professor and associate chair for research at the University of Southern California, Mrs. T.H. Chan, Division of Occupational Therapy Science and Occupational Therapy. Dr. Lawler's research program reflects her commitment to the development of effective and compassionate partnerships and interventions among children with developmental and special health care needs, their families and communities, with particular attention given to populations who are chronically underserved. Her research interests include examining the meanings of illness and disability in family and community life, the social nature of therapeutic experiences, social cultural influences on healthcare and health equity, developmental processes, narrative structuring of social action, and occupational science perspectives on living and learning in everyday life. Most recently, she has focused on community engagements for adolescents and young adults, their families, and clinicians with whom they partner up. She is currently project lead for a PCORI project entitled Transforming Research, Understanding Sensory Experience in ASD Stakeholders Working Together, or TRUST. She has previously been funded by several agencies and foundations, including NICHD at NIH. She is a member of the AOTF Academy of Research and has recently served as chair for the Board of Trustees for the American Occupational Therapy Foundation, where I had the distinct pleasure of serving alongside her. Congratulations, Dr. Lawler.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you. Thank you, Christy. And thank you to everyone for this great honor. I'm humbled, I'm honored, and deeply appreciative. I do look forward to the year. Christy, I appreciate the introduction and the welcome, but she told me she needed to give me some advice, and it was to really enjoy this year. So I'm really planning on doing that. So I appreciate the permission and the advice and all of that. I'm also looking forward to having a chance to reflect on all that I've learned from the various mentors, students, mentees, and certainly all the families who've engaged with us in our research and our stakeholder engagement projects. I also want to thank AOTA for this award, and I want to thank the USC Chan Division of Occupational Science and my colleagues, and particularly Dr. Grace Baranek for the nomination and the support of my colleagues. I also want to thank the contributors to our research project. As most of you know, it takes a team, and look forward to being able to represent some of what we've worked on and what we've said. I want to just close in thanking collaborators that I've worked with, and also my colleagues at AOTF. So thank you, and I look forward to returning to Kansas City. Thanks.
Can you let him go?
Oh, Mary? Okay. Here we go.
Congratulations on your talk. It was great.
This concludes the 2022 Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecture. Thank you.